Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture. The McFarland Center sponsors a range of conferences, lectures, special events on campus that address questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. One of the most delightful things that we get to do, one of the most important things that we get to do is with a group of colleagues, many of whom are here, help coordinate lectures in the Kraft-Hiatt series on Jewish Christian understanding, Kraft-Hiatt program. And that program sponsors a range of events, sending students to Yad Vashem, to Hebrew University in the summer. We've sent faculty to Yad Vashem. We help get started some Maymesters. There's a great Maymester course that's running on its own through that. So a variety of things that we've done to help foster understanding of Judaism, Jewish life, and Jewish Christian understanding. For a number of years, we've been really fortunate to host Alan Rosen, a renowned scholar of Holocaust literature, as our Kraft-Hiatt scholar in residence. I'm really delighted today, not because of the topic we're going to discuss, but to welcome Alan back to be among us, because he's a really delightful, wonderful person who's been really a benefit to students over the years, visiting Montserrat classes and the like. Due to COVID, we hadn't had him here in a few years, though he did come and participate in a number of classes online, and maybe some of you met him that way. We're really delighted to have the opportunity to have him back here on campus. Today's talk is being recorded, so you'll be able to share it with friends and the like later and see that online at holycross.edu/McFarland Center. Dr. Alan Rosen is a lecturer at Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center in Jerusalem, and he's held fellowships at the Foundation pour la Mémoire de la Shoah in Paris and the United States Memorial Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. He serves as a project director for the Wiesel Center for Living Archive at the 92nd Street Y in New York City. He studied under the late Elie Wiesel. Many of you probably may have read his students. I hope you've read his students. The renowned Holocaust survivor and Nobel Prize winner. And is the editor of a number of collections that publish and reflect on Wiesel's work, including most recently Filled with Fire and Light in 2021. He's also this edited book, The Literature of the Holocaust, another edition we're making to the library here. He's author of books including The Sounds of Defiance, The Holocaust, Multilingualism, and the Problem of English, The Wonder of Their Voices, the 1946 Holocaust Interviews with David Broder, and The Holocaust Jewish Calendars, Keeping Time Sacred, Making Time Holy, which was awarded the 2020 Yad Vashem International Book Prize, and he had spoken about that here before that. He first started that project with us in 2011, actually. Today, he's speaking on Torah and Mitzvahs. What might we learn from the astounding Jewish religious activity in Auschwitz? So please join me in welcoming back Alan Rosen.
Rabbi Sinai Adler's description of Hanukkah, the holiday of Hanukkah, in the Birkenau concentration camp, Birkenau Auschwitz concentration camp, reveals the special nature of lighting a makeshift menorah. And I quote Rabbi Adler, "The first night of Hanukkah, we gathered together on the upper tier of one of the sleeping platforms, and we lit the candle which was so precious to us. The burning candle kindled in our hearts new hope for the future and strengthened our trust." A line from one of the favored hymns that we sing to accompany the lighting of the Hanukkah menorah candelabra. Ma'otzor Yeshua si. The trust in God, the rock of our salvation in the Birkenau concentration camp, the new hope, the future it envisioned, the camaraderie of gathering together on the upper tier of one of the platforms. All of these spiritually nourishing elements invoked by Rabbi Adler were clearly a powerful incentive to participate in the mitzvah of lighting the Hanukkah menorah. Nevertheless, his participation in the ceremony took place despite the fact that it was forbidden to do so, and that the prisoners who gathered together ran the risk of being discovered and cruelly punished. Other mitzvahs were pursued by Jewish prisoners in Auschwitz-Birkenau with equal ardor. These mitzvahs included studying the Torah, acquiring sacred books, reciting prayers and blessings, endeavoring to eat kosher food, wearing a talit and tefillin. I'll explain more about those shortly. Honoring Torah sages and leaders, observing the Sabbath and festivals, and crafting a Jewish calendar that would serve as a guide to such observance. While kindling the Hanukkah lights may have had a particularly rich historical associations with the defiance of a ruthless enemy, these other mitzvahs drew on similar legacies of perseverance in the face of torture or even death. They too were in their own fashion a rock of salvation, giving hope to the Jewish prisoners of Auschwitz, strengthening their trust and helping to envision a future beyond the terrible anguish of the moment. From the start, circa 1933, the Nazis erected special prisons, i.e., concentration camps, to deal with those who were perceived as enemies and to terrorize the population at large. As the German Empire grew, these arenas of terror came to dot the whole European landscape. Special camps exploited the labor of millions of prisoners, treating them, in Benjamin Ferencza's phrase, as less than slaves. From late 1941 to 1945, death camps operating in German-occupied Poland murdered millions of Jews. A few nefarious sites joined together the exploitation of labor with systematic murder. Other so-called transit camps served as way stations to sites of labor, or more often, to factories of death. The largest of the concentration camps, Auschwitz-Birkenau, was said to have been cut off from the rest of the world. Located outside the city of Krakow in the southwestern corner of Silesian Poland, the notorious Auschwitz complex actually consisted of three main camps. Auschwitz I, established in 1940, incarcerated ostensible enemies of Nazi Germany. Auschwitz II, known as Birkenau, established in 1942, served as a site of forced labor and systematic murder. And Auschwitz III, referred to also as Buna Monowitz, established in late 1942, functioned as a massive industrial complex of slave labor. Non-Jews, as well as Jews, were imprisoned in the camp. but the largest number who entered, and by far the largest percentage of those who perished there, were Jews. Torah and mitzvahs in hell. It's a sad subject that I'll try to give a certain perspective on, where we're not going to be left sad, but we're going to be left astonished. Astonished at the perseverance, astonished at the cleverness, savvy, and dedication of Jewish prisoners, astonished that such activities took place at all. And we'll go through a number of different examples that will look at Torah and mitzvahs in hell. Torah being what the Jews refer to, more popularly known as the Bible, and the sacred books of Scripture that are the life nourishment for Jews since thousands of years ago. And those books of Torah, of the Bible, were such to be studied, learned, and lived according to, by prisoners, as well as by those of us who have the great privilege of living in more or less freedom, that they are our guide. So we will chart the course of the way that Torah, on the one hand, mitzvahs on the other, helped Jewish prisoners to navigate, sometimes successfully, other times leading to tragic ends in the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. Mitzvahs refer to commandments. The Torah, according to Jewish belief, has not only the 10 Commandments that we're all familiar with, but rather 613 commandments. It's a few more than 10. And so that our entire life is choreographed by the Torah in what we do, what we eat, what we celebrate, with whom, how, when. If you think, in a not terribly good parallel, of a dance choreography where every step is such to be able to bring out in the dancer the greatest eloquence, so it is with the commandments of the Torah that are referred to by Jews as mitzvahs, mitzvot. And so our exploration then, this evening, is to see how Jews continue to abide by the mitzvahs, the commandments, even under such perilous, oppressive conditions. That said, it's really very important to thank my hosts. It's so special to be back in person. I'm not sure I thought that we or I would ever get here, but to Professor Tom Landes and the Kraft-Hiatt committee's great credit, even during the most intensive moments of Corona. I think the belief was there that it was worthwhile to maintain our special conversation and contact, and do that by Zoom, by phone call, by writing tons of emails, and that really continued to be special in its own right. And then to be able to bring about, when the circumstances allowed for myself to come on the invitation of this distinguished committee to return to the college. So thank you to Professor Landy and to the other members of the committee, and I trust that we'll continue to continue this important conversation. Now in the world, with various struggles that have been with us since time immemorial, they're not new, but they're intense, and they're sometimes ugly, and they're sometimes difficult to believe that they could be going on with such ferocity. Living in Israel aside too, that the stakes always seem to be higher and the temperature of the friction seems to be greater. But then remember the great conversations that are going on that try together to navigate our way, and we persevere. And God willing, we'll continue to do that. In an interview given a few years ago, the same Rabbi Sinai Adler gives a somewhat different twist to the observance of mitzvahs, of commandments in Auschwitz-Birkenau. To him, it really had a straightforward logic, and I quote, "People sometimes see religious observance during the Holocaust as a kind of heroism. It isn't heroic. If you could observe the commandments, then you observed them. If you couldn't, then you were exempt from the observing of the commandments," end of quote. Rabbi Adler's downplaying of heroism in regard to observance of mitzvahs in Auschwitz-Birkenau dovetails with the comments, the sage comments of one of the great commentators on the period, Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz, emphasis on what he called the continuity of existence. Religious Jews in ghettos and camps more generally, writes Rabbi Berkovitz, did not depart from our customary ways, despite the privation and cruelty that defined imprisonment in Auschwitz. There was nonetheless the insistence of religious Jews on continuing even there in the camps as before, meaning just as before imprisonment, a religious Jew endeavored to observe the 613 mitzvahs, commandments that the Torah legislates. So did the Jew in Auschwitz endeavor to conduct his or her life in a similar spirit, similar vein. It might be added that, at least for some, customary ways refer to habits of religious life so ingrained, so much a part of the fabric of lived life that they had become drives or reflexes equal to any other, breathing, eating, and so on. As Rabbi Adler's comments imply, Jews in Auschwitz were exempt from many or most mitzvahs, commandments. Indeed, in the vast majority of cases, one is not obliged to risk one's life or limb to observe any given commandment. The preservation of life is a sacred value, a mitzvah in its own right that supersedes nearly all others. Yet, even while honoring the exemptions in order to preserve one's life, the aspiration to act as before, as one did before imprisonment, often remained. The constant threat of punishment and death did not dampen the prisoners' ardor for mitzvah doing. In regard to Jewish religious activity in Auschwitz, written and oral testimony tells of the wide range of persons, background, and circumstances who undertook to observe mitzvahs in hell. Young and old, women and men, Ashkenazim and Sephardim, two different groups of Jews, one from northern Central Europe, the Ashkenazim, Sephardim from southern Europe and North Africa, who were also imprisoned in the camps. Distinguished rabbis and rebbitzins, along with ordinary individuals. Indeed, the circle was very broadly drawn. Prisoners who were not even traditionally religious were sometimes also moved to observe these commandments, perhaps drawn in by the hope, trust, and camaraderie implied in Rabbi Adler's account of the menorah candelabra lighting on Hanukkah. The Jewish prisoners of Auschwitz performed such acts of devotion under all kinds of conditions, by day and by night, outside or indoors, as individuals or members of a group, avoiding the surveillance of camp officials or being assisted by them, using conventional or unconventional strategies, undertaking a one-time action or doing something on a daily basis. Even the fraught moments of arriving at or leaving the confines of Auschwitz-Birkenau became an opportunity for prayer and good deeds. We hear, for example, of Rabbi Aaron Felberbaum, who came from the region of Slovakia, Ungvar. He was the rabbi of the town of Gajvic, who they were deported along with other Hungarian Jews in late spring 1944. He's the grandfather of a friend of mine, the Posners, if you know them. Anyone knows the Posners in Boston, Mrs. Posner's grandfather. After 4 days of travel in a railroad boxcar with neither food nor drink, Rabbi Aaron stepped onto the rail platform of Auschwitz-Birkenau carrying a single possession, a Torah scroll that had been in his family for generations, that was handed down from the great sage Rabbi Mordechai of Nordvarna. When he refused to throw it to the ground upon arrival, the Nazi guards beat him to death with metal clubs. So certainly the observance did not by any means necessarily end in a good way. Being compelled to leave Auschwitz on a death march, which happened in winter of 1945, itself became an occasion to leave the camp and recite what is known as the traveler's prayer, which we Jews recite when you're traveling from one place to another. And it begins, may it be your will, God, and our God, and the God of our forebears, that you should lead us in peace and direct our steps in peace and guide us in peace and support us in peace and cause us to reach our destination in life, joy, and peace. Sophie Zollberg, who we've heard about some years back and we'll hear about more later, of blessed memory, joined a number of other young women to say the prayer before heading out on the death march in January 17th, 1945, in the Jewish calendar, the 5th of Tevet, Tafshin Hey. And in her riveting words, she said, "Never before or never since have I said that prayer as I did that night." With various levels of risk and difficulty, religious activity was carried out in all sectors of the camp, Auschwitz I, II, and III, and, as we will hear briefly at least, among the Sonderkommando, the special unit, which had grim work, which I'll comment on soon. Research and study of religious Jewish responses in Auschwitz both draws on general resources and relies on specialized ones. Likewise, testimony that recounts religious Jewish activity can be found in general collections and also in lesser-known archives with this special focus. In a similar spirit, diaries, memories, anthologies, with an emphasis on religious Jewish observance during the Holocaust, are often brought out by publishers that, for the most part, are not in the holding of university libraries. We were just going through the holdings, and most of those come from academic presses who do not feel obliged to publish, but rather there are, off the beaten track presses that do commit themselves in this fashion. The encyclopedic anthology called Shema Yisrael offers a particularly rich harvest in terms of English language resources, containing, as it does, 42 pages of Auschwitz testimony translated from Yiddish and Hebrew, which are the languages that generally that testimony comes in. The volume's inspiration and catalyst, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Taub, known as the Koliver Rebbe, was particularly resolute in commemorating the Holocaust. Having himself, as a youth, been imprisoned in Auschwitz-Birkenau, he creatively infused remembrance and knowledge of Jewish religious response into much of his post-war life and activities. And then it should be mentioned, Rabbi Taub was one of the great senior rabbis in first New York and then in Jerusalem. And among such rabbis, it's standard practice to have a beard something like mine, but usually a bit longer and fuller. Rabbi Taub, having been the subject of experiments at Auschwitz-Birkenau, was unable to grow a beard, so always appeared clean-shaven, was the only one of the group. And those same experiments kept him from being able to have a family of his own, which did not in any way stop him from his commemorative or pastoral activities. Indeed, the volume's title of this volume that he brought out, Shema Yisrael, refers to the prayer which, central to many facets of Jewish worship and devotion, was recited by those in Auschwitz and elsewhere as they faced their final moments. If you look at the final page of Viktor Frankl's great memoir, Man's Search for Meaning, he talks about the memory that we sustain of Jews going to their imminent death, reciting Shema Yisrael, and it's documented in a number of places. Rabbi Staub himself would call upon audiences, Jewish and Gentile alike, to recite the prayer together as a way to remember the murdered victims. Although the book Shema Yisrael contains a lengthy chapter entitled, in general, the camps, meaning the concentration camps, Auschwitz is the only one of the concentration or death camps to be given its own chapter, which gives us a sense of the centrality of Auschwitz-Birkenau in the commemoration of the Holocaust, in the research in the Holocaust, in the testimony of the Holocaust. In contrast, academic Holocaust histories, even those that give some attention to religious Jewry, such as that by Lucy Davidovitz or Shaul Friedlander, they don't include Jewish religious activity in their discussions of Auschwitz. What my colleague Javi Dreyfus has referred to as a blind spot in relation to the study of Jewish religious activity during the period of the Holocaust in general also appears to obtain in relation to the study of Auschwitz-Birkenau in particular. Search high and low that we will. One doesn't find. And I just should mention that my comments tonight are based on a chapter that I was asked to contribute to a forthcoming volume, the Rutledge Handbook on Auschwitz-Birkenau, edited by Sarah Cushman and a few other people. And so they're trying to go in a different direction to bring into academic research what previously has been overlooked. Be that as it may, some of the most widely circulated testimonial accounts refer to Jewish religious observance. Elie Wiesel, for example, deported from Siget to Hungary as a teenage boy, is known for his memoir, Night. How many of you have read Elie Wiesel's Night? A little bit higher. It kind of blends in with the chairs. Good. Great. Thank you. So a good number. It's read by thousands every year. Thank God. Which tells of his arrival in Auschwitz in late spring 1944 and his 6 months of imprisonment therein. Night also highlights the prayer service of Rosh Hashanah in 1944 and the debate about fasting on Yom Kippur that took place. Yom Kippur is the most, stringent of the fasts, of the handful of fasts that Jews are commanded to observe during the year. And even in Auschwitz, there was a thought that this perhaps should be honored here, even when they were fasting in their own way every day. Yet, Professor Wiesel also expands on this account in many other forums, referring to the daily learning of Torah, while on his work detail, the determination of himself and his father to regularly don tefillin in the darkness of the early morning hours, and the inspired lighting on his part, like Rabbi Sinai Adler, his lighting of a menorah during Hanukkah of 1944. I never stopped learning, Professor Wiesel comments in a lecture, even during the war inside that place of malediction, because I knew enough Talmud, the commentary on the Bible, by heart. And I had one coworker who was a famous head of a yeshiva, and we were carrying stones, and we were discussing two of the sages in their views, Abaye and Rava, meaning a page in the Talmud about something that happened 2,500 years ago, whether the high priest wore one kind of vestment or another kind of vestment. And it was so important to us to know what he did 2,500 years ago while we were forced to be carrying these stones. That was learning. Professor Wiesel wasn't, of course, the only one. Rabbi Yehuda Tzvi Mark that writes that after work, the daily grind of many, many hours of hard labor, my father, he says, would organize night classes on a part of the Mishnah, again, a part of the Talmud, that he knew by heart. Or Rabbi Eliyahu Rubin writes that at twilight, at the time of the third Sabbath meal, people would give Torah-related talks, kept short as not to arouse attention. Or the great Rabbi Halberstam, also known as the Klausenberger Rebbe, would give such talks as well, would study Talmud on his way to work. Why? Because we're told that you should speak of them, the mitzvahs, when you walk on the way. Rabbi Mendel Kleinser, I'm saying rabbi, these were younger people, they became rabbis, but often they were not at that time. They were young men trying to stay alive. He wrote down passages from the Talmud, as did Rabbi Adler, who we've heard about, and Rabbi Aviad Borstein. On Sundays, when the prisoners had a different schedule, he would organize a Sunday Torah talk, and there would be prayer along with. Elsewhere in his writings, Elie Wiesel tells of a daring fidelity to the mitzvah of wrapping tefillin. Somebody bought a pair of tefillin from somebody who brought it in, and people would get up, my father and I would get up before everyone else and go and stand in line to put on tefillin and wear tefillin and say the blessings. You know very well, says Professor Wiesel, this is not one of the comments for which one has to risk one's life. Why did we do it? I don't know. My father did it. I did it with him. End of quote. Let me just, in case there's some or one or any that have never seen a pair of tefillin, let me bring out. So tefillin are then boxes colored black with straps, one of which goes on one's arm. Men do this during the morning prayers generally, and one of which goes on the head. And inside are written the various prayer passages from the Torah, from the Bible, that refer to the mitzvah of wearing tefillin. But the actual shape, size, color, layout of tefillin are there embryonically in the Torah, but it's only in the rabbis' commentaries in the Talmud that we actually know what they're supposed to look like. So it's, as one rabbi put it, it's putting the name of God on one's body and being strengthened by that. It's a commandment, that's why it's done. And Elie Wiesel, his father, as we hear, did that at risk. If one's discovered, and there were some discovered in Auschwitz, one might well be murdered right there on the spot. This was also done by the friend, teacher, rabbi, one could say, Professor Wiesel, Rabbi Menashe Klein, Shlomo Rossman snuck in a pair of tefillin, and he wore them with great joy. Simcha Bunim Unsdorfer, He marveled at his brother's ingenuity to bring tefillin into the Auschwitz Birkenau camp, and wrote in comment on that, the enemy could kill bodies, but they couldn't kill courage. Amazing statement. Rabbi Ephraim Greenblatt traded his bread rations for the possibility of being able to obtain a pair of tefillin. Rabbi Rosenberg writes that the merit of wearing tefillin, which he did, saved his life. He owes it, that's how he understood. And Rabbi Sinai Adler, with whom we began lighting a Hanukkah menorah candelabra, an amazing story where he was able to use a pair of tefillin. He took them into a tool shed next where he was working. There was no one else around. He was there. He went in. He put them on. He said the Shema Yisrael prayer, which one does when wearing tefillin. And all of a sudden, out of the corner of his eye, he sees an SS man, two, entering the tool shed. He thought, that's it. That's it. There was no one else around, and now it's all over. And somehow, he says, that they simply walked by, somehow not seeing him in the corner, which he attributes to a miracle, but that his life was, in that moment, completely on the line, and the tefillin had something to do with his own going forward. In relation to the holiday of Hanukkah, Professor Wiesel again writes that there was a head of a yeshiva in his barracks who took the lead in obtaining the materials necessary to light the candelabra, obtaining potatoes that they dug out and put as candles and a little cup of oil. Professor Wiesel, the boy of 15 at the time, was at first skeptical that the ceremony was worth the life and death risk. Hanukkah in Auschwitz, he said, and the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the yeshiva, said, especially in Auschwitz. In the end, quotes, says Professor Wiesel, and I quote, the entire block, the entire barracks of prisoners participated in the ceremony. Everyone listened to the blessing and responded with a large Amen. Amen. That's what one said. And sang the popular melodies of Hanukkah like Ma'otzor Yeshua. And we find numbers of other examples of prisoners who not only lit the Hanukkah menorah, but for Jews, it's a mitzvah, it's a commandment, to light candles honoring other festivals, including the Sabbath, the Passover, Shavuos, Sukkot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. Every holiday is honored and entered into with the lighting of candles, which usually devolves upon the women because they're the leaders of the family and the home. And there were many examples. For example, the Koliver Rebbitzin, the wife of Rabbi Taub, that her insisting on lighting candles for Yom Kippur, even while the head, called the capo of the block, was completely against, completely anti-religious activities. And she knew that it was likely she would be reported. And when she asked her, at first she was slapped, but she continued to do it. And she says, when this woman, a Jewish woman, she came in and saw, the woman started crying. Remembering what was the case before the war. Some seasoned spiritual leaders not only strove to remain as before in their own personal observance, but also tried to help and influence others to do so. This included a cadre of what were known as the Beis Yaakov girls. There was a religious Orthodox Jewish girls schools that were established in Eastern Europe in the 1920s and 30s, and the graduates of those schools were an elite cadre of those under any circumstances committed to continuing with mitzvah observance. The two names that are most often associated as leaders were Tzilla Orleon and Tilla Rindner, and there were numbers of others who persevered somehow, and not all survived, but some. And they report, and there's numbers of memoirs and commentary on their work. Also, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Meisels, known as the Dayan of Weizen, was deported to Auschwitz at the end of May 1944. He was then 42 years old. The fate of the imprisoned Jews was starkly clear to him, and I quote, "When we were in Auschwitz under the hands of the Nazis," he wrote in his 1955 memoir, "the Jews were beaten and oppressed, and many fell into the depths of despair," end of quote. Despite the many risks involved, he took it upon himself to raise spirits through reciting and studying psalms, obtaining and blowing a shofar on Rosh Hashanah, building a sukkah, and for his own spiritual sustenance, wearing a talit of a distinguished ancestor. A Rosh Hashanah shofar blowing the ram's horn on Rosh Hashanah, the central commandment of that day, could only take place if the time of the holiday was known, which in Auschwitz was a challenge of its own kind. Prisoners were not allowed to possess the basic tools to track time, such as calendars or watches. And a rigid work routine, moreover, was in place 6 days a week and kept time largely undifferentiated. All in all, the Auschwitz prisoners' day, comments one observer, was hollow, empty, and mirthless, lacking any novelty and enveloped in everlasting gloom. Yet amid this gloom, Jewish holidays were known about, at least by a number of prisoners, and in a fashion observed. Banned from prisoner possession and use, Jewish calendars nonetheless turned up. Jewish calendar, like the Gregorian calendar, is generally a 12-month calendar. The months have either 29 or 30 days. It's a lunar calendar. The weeks are 7 days, but different from the Gregorian calendar, the days do not have names but go by numbers. The first day of the week, the second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day. The only day that has a name is the Sabbath day. And the dating of the Jewish year takes place from what is traditionally deemed to be the time of creation of the world. So we're now in the year 5783, and very importantly, for study of the Holocaust, to my mind and that of some others. The Jewish day begins at nighttime, meaning we're right now at the end of a day, and the new day will start this evening. So that the Jewish day goes from darkness to light. It's always that movement, from darkness to light. Yeshaya Glick, 14 years old, recounts that he copied a festival calendar onto a prayer book and shared it with fellow inmates in the so-called boys' barracks in Birkenau. Another special case is that of Rabbi Eliyahu Herman, who, when deported from Budapest to Auschwitz in 1944, had strapped to his leg a pocket calendar, a set of tefillin, and a book of Psalms. 2, maybe 3 examples exist of Jewish calendars being made from scratch in Auschwitz, and both of the ones that we know for sure are by women. Sophie Zollberg, who we mentioned before, came from an Orthodox home in Munich and attended a religious school staffed by graduates from the prestigious Jewish Teachers Seminary in Würzburg. She took the calendar with her that she made and that survived. She took with her on the death march into Germany, used it to track time once the war ended, and brought it with her to Israel. Annalisa Borinsky, from her part, came from an assimilated German Jewish background, turned to Zionism in the 1930s, and like Sophie, made her way to Israel at the war's end. So we see that among very different kinds of people, this drive to make a calendar, to know when the holidays were, to be able to share it with fellow prisoners, was something that was at the forefront of consciousness for a number. Some locations in Auschwitz offered a greater opportunity for mitzvah observance. The so-called Staubsgebäude was one of these, which was a collection of indoor prisoner details meant to provide basic services for camp administration and guards, laundry, mending, and so on. It was a paradise compared to Birkenau because there were no selections. Prisoners could wash, and there were other life-preserving benefits for the 100 to 300 women that staffed that section. The Sonderkommando were groups of Jewish prisoners, as I mentioned before, whom the Nazis forced to perform various despicable tasks in the gas chambers and crematoria of Auschwitz-Birkenau, including disposing of the bodies of murdered prisoners. The enemy, the SS, Machschmam, usually killed members of the Sonderkommando after a few months, replacing them with other prisoners. Very few survived. Paradoxically, in several ways, their unfortunate work assignments facilitated observance of mitzvahs by making available religious books to fill in prayer shawls, as well as by giving them a measure of privacy to pray, study outside of the purview of the enemy. In conclusion, Jews of Auschwitz did not leave behind their Jewish life when they entered the camp. It too, the Jewish life, became a prisoner of the camp. The freedom to observe mitzvahs on a regular basis without fear of reprisal was no longer an option. Yet, as we've heard, the aspiration remained to perform what mitzvahs one could and whatever observance could be carried out became the order of the day. What might we learn from this astonishing resolution on the part of Jews imprisoned in Auschwitz? One, what do we learn about Auschwitz? How does this give us a clue in a different way to what Auschwitz was? Two, what do we learn about Jews from such a survey as the one that we've briefly taken account of? And three, what does it teach us about life by knowing what was done? First, about Auschwitz. Chronicling the observance of mitzvahs in Auschwitz broadens the canvas of prisoner life and directs our attention to the traditional Jewish activity that existed in the camp. It reverses the assumption that when Jews arrived, they were stripped of their religious and cultural identity as they were stripped of their clothes. It also qualifies the assumption that the onerous conditions in the camp left no time, energy, or inclination for prayer, for study, for calendar making. For some prisoners, this may have indeed been the case, but it was not a general axiom, and other prisoners had or found the time, energy, and inclination to continue to observe mitzvahs. The fact that in most cases religious observance in Auschwitz meant going against the rules of the camp may lead to classifying the observance of mitzvahs as a form of spiritual resistance. Yet the statements of Rabbi Adler and Rabbi Berkowitz add a complicating layer to our understanding. They presumed that the religious Jews who by the thousands entered Auschwitz endeavored to conduct their lives according to their previous standards and habits. Circumstances may have changed drastically, but the terms by which a Jew's life was measured did not change. In this light, defiance was not the main consideration. It was rather the determination to live a life guided by the Torah and thus live as a servant of God. Second, what do we learn about Jews? Jews do not seek out suffering or persecution. But if faced with it, Jews do not change what they do, what we do, which traditionally speaking means to study the Torah, carry out the commandments, celebrate the holidays, eat kosher food, pray and say blessings, light candles for Shabbos, Sabbath day festivals, and Hanukkah, as we've seen. And even when we're subjected to circumstances oppressive to the degree that we can't fulfill some or most of the 613 commandments that we are commanded to do, we know that too, that not being able to is a provision of the Torah and thus of God's will. And I want to just slant slightly to tell the story that I think reveals it's not in the context of Auschwitz, but it's a special story, and I think it illuminates this. 250 years ago, there were two great Jewish sages who were also brothers, Rabbi Elimelech of Lezhensk and Rabbi Zusha of Annapolis, two of the great sages in the pantheon of the 18th century, Judaism coming out of the Hasidic movement. They used to go around together and collect money to free Jews who had been thrown into prison for not paying their rent, supposedly for other trivial reasons, and they needed to be ransomed. So they would go around and collect money. They came to a town, and the townspeople were suspicious of what they were doing, and they were thrown into jail. And it was not a happy place to be. But being religious Jews, time came to pray, and they got ready to say their daily prayers. And then one of them, Rabbi Zusha, he noticed that in the middle of the prison room, there was a chamber pot. And the chamber pot, which had its uses, also exuded a rather foul smell. And the Torah teaches that one has to pray in a place where one's not going to be disturbed by such foul smells. So Rabbi Zusha, who noticed the chamber pot, started sobbing. What are we going to do? We can't say our prayers. Where are we going to go? We're in the jail cell. You can't go into another room. You can't go into the lobby. You can't go, and there's no synagogue. What are we going to do? And he was sobbing away. And his brother Elimelech said, but Zusha, that too is God's will. The fact that we're not praying, because of the odor, we're also following the Torah. And Zusha said, really? I said, sure. He said, that's incredible. And he became so exuberant that he took his brother's hands and started to dance and sing, bum, 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 bum. They both composed songs, and they were dancing around the prison. The other prisoners saw, a good time. So they stepped up and they started dancing, and pretty soon the whole jail cell was singing and dancing around the chamber pot, because you can dance around if you can say your prayers there. And the noise was such that the prison guard outside was roused. And he knocked and he came in and he said, what's all this ruckus? What's going on? And someone explained, he said, you think you're going to have a good time dancing around this chamber pot? I'll show you. And he bent down, picked up the chamber pot, and took it outside the prison. And Reb Zusha said, now, Elimelech, we can pray. So the idea of not also being God's will was a huge driving force of the exemption of mitzvahs. And finally, what do we learn about life? No one can imagine what it was like to be in prison in Auschwitz. As my teacher, Elie Wiesel, said, those who were not in Auschwitz can never enter, and those who were in Auschwitz can never leave. End of quote. But I imagine that everyone here tonight has sadly undergone their own measure of suffering, torment, and anguish. Life is such that no one is spared hardship, loss, and injury to body or soul or both. Some people seem destined to suffer greatly, and others seem to suffer far less. Yet all of us at some point taste the bitter edge of pain and the awful depth of sadness. We learn then from the astonishing resolve of the Jewish prisoners of Auschwitz that no one, nothing, can sever our connection to what is most dear to us. No one and nothing can upend traditions that guide and form us, that make us who we are, and that connect us to God, family, friends, and meaning. So that we too, like the indomitable Sophie Zollberg, can aspire to transform a march of death into another of life's journeys, taken under the watchful eye of God. As the prayer that Sophie offered states, I quote, "May it be your will, God, our God, and the God of our forebears, that you should lead us in peace and direct our steps in peace and guide us in peace and support us in peace and cause us to reach our destination in life, joy, and peace." Thank you. Questions, comments are always welcome, are a special part of our gathering. Don't hesitate, there's never a wrong question.
Being recorded, I just asked people to use the microphone.
Okay, so there's even a microphone there. I'm happy to share mine, but there's one there. Never a wrong question. What?
Elie Wiesel at night, of course, talks about his own struggle with the continued observance of mitzvot in Auschwitz, and I wonder if you might just reflect on that a little bit, on the other side. Of course, for him in night, he both does and doesn't, but there's a deep poignance also to his response when he sees some of these activities.
Great. Could everyone hear Professor Avery Peck? Yes? Elie Wiesel at night. So, in the 1990s, Professor Wiesel was interviewed by, I think her name is Krista Tippett. Is that right? Something like that. It's close, if not. They are a famous interviewer. So she said, "Professor Wiesel, you know, you talk about your faith being consumed. Can you comment on that? In night, that's such a powerful, eloquent statement. What about your faith today?" So he said to her, "Oh, you stopped reading too soon." She said, "What?" He said, "No, you see, soon after I make that statement, I also talk about praying on Rosh Hashanah. And so you stopped reading before you got to my prayers. And if I'm praying, it's such to be able to say that my faith continued even in the aftermath of that." So that's a general way that he responds, meaning that night, or the first part of night, or certain sections of night, saw things in a particularly grim lens. And that in order to be able to have a sense of proportion and know that, that faith persevered, observance persevered, Torah and mitzvahs, as we heard from what I read, persevered, you have to read further. So one of my not so hidden agendas tonight was to read from other writings and lectures of Elie Wiesel, because while Night is, of course, a great book, it's the book that he wrote when he was a young man, and he wrote 60 books after, and 1,000 articles, and gave thousands of lectures. And in order to be able to, not only to know what Elie Wiesel thought and felt and believed, but in order to know what it means to confront and go forward, begin again, begin afresh after Auschwitz, we need to follow his own journey, because he'll take us along with it. Thank you. Others? I couldn't have answered everything. I mean, it was a fantastic lecture, but yes, Professor Bitron.
It's always a pleasure hearing you speak, and it is a bit intimidating to rise and ask a question, especially after you enthrall people with your talk. But I did wonder whether or not the automaticity that you referred to of those prisoners who could do nothing other than observe mitzvahs, whether that was in fact a requirement to keep their faith alive. And those that may not have had that, perhaps were less able to maintain their faith. Do you have any thoughts on that possibility?
Just the first part again. Just to say it again, because I'm not sure. I think I may have it. I want to be sure.
Yes, you quoted Rabbi Adler as saying that these religious Jews keeping the mitzvahs was not heroic.
Right.
It was just in their fiber to do
Yeah.
so.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering whether or not that automaticity of religious observance was a requirement to maintain their faith, or whether those that lacked it were more able or were more susceptible to losing their faith if they had any to begin with.
Thank you. It's a tough question. First, I mean, there are unfortunately, so many prisoners did not come out of Auschwitz. We have the writings of some that did, but thousands and thousands and thousands. So what was their experience? They were said to have ended their lives by saying the credo of Judaism, if you will, Shema Yisrael. But I shouldn't say we, I don't, first of all, I'm not sure I should judge. Second, we just don't know what they were experiencing in that just awful, awful place in those moments. And I mean, I think Rabbi Adler's focus there is he's wanting to say that Jews, as I'm sure you understand and can comment on and reflect in your own great way. But he's trying to say that if you grew up in a certain way, that you just kept living in that way. That's what you knew, and that's what you did, and so it wasn't heroic because you were doing just what you taught in the same way that someone would do it here, in the same way that one's taught to hold the door open for an elderly person, or to be able to get something for someone that's disabled, or so on and so forth. We know what to do if you're brought up with the proper kind of respect for the powers that you have and are God-given and what someone else may not have. You know how to act. So I think he was saying we were brought up, he does say that in the extended version. I was brought up in a certain way. He talks about actually, he was on the railroad car coming there with his family, and his father realized that it was the beginning of the Sabbath of Shabbos. And he saw that in the midst of the chaos and of the just bewilderment, that his father reached into his pocket and took out a small kind of cube of bread, held it in his hands, and he made kiddush. Meaning he sanctified the Sabbath day. As they were on the tree. He says, unbelievable, but that's what we did. And my father was just being true to what he always did at that time in that way, that it was a railroad car, okay, that they didn't know where they were going or being taken to, okay, but that's what he did. So that's how I understand Rabbi Adler's emphasis in wanting to play down the aspect of heroism. So it's broader implications as you're very thoughtfully bringing us to see, what allowed some people to maintain faith and others less. I don't know. Thanks. Please. Yes, sir. Who are you, sir?
My name is Dennis Cohen.
Yes.
I don't go to college here.
Well, we'll try to arrange, certain possibilities. We have connections.
We come here often, but I don't go to school here. I
Okay.
wanted to let people know that there was a memoir written by a woman from Worcester who has since passed away and who was a Holocaust survivor. She came to Worcester from Israel, but she was born in Munich, Germany, and her story begins around the time that she's in first grade, second grade, and so maybe it was 1933, before Kristallnacht. And her name is Thea, Thea, Ashkenaz, Ashkenaze. And she came to Worcester as an adult from Israel, from Europe, from Italy, from Auschwitz, from Munich. Mm-hmm. And the book is a memoir that she wrote as she was studying for her bachelor's degree at Worcester State College as an 80-year-old woman. So I recommend.
How old when she?
Probably she was 80 when she started.
Yeah.
Mid-70s.
Yeah.
Okay. She lived most of her adult life in Clinton, came to Worcester, and the book, I don't know, is it called something, or is it just, what's the title of the book? Do you know? Okay. Thea Ashkenaz.
Yeah.
It is an amazing story written by not a professional writer, but she was helped by the English department at Worcester State University. And if anybody wants to read about what the Holocaust was like, and what the trains were like, and what Auschwitz was like, and what Joseph Mengele was like, that's the book.
Thank you very much. we'll look for it. Just one, please, Thomas, please, just a comment that Auschwitz, many of the Jews who, thank God, survived Auschwitz were Hungarian Jews, not Thea Ashkenazi, not Sophie Zollberg, who also came from Munich and was about the same age and were in Auschwitz for a longer period of time and somehow made it. But the Hungarian Jews spent, like Elie Wiesel, something or approximately like 6 months. And if one was young and more or less healthy and was then selected for the work details and was blessed, one could sometimes make it through. So many of the testimonies that we have are from that portion of the Auschwitz prisoners who came from Hungary. And that also means that we have a lot of testimony of the kind that was just our attention was brought to, some of which was written up and published, others of which are part of the of archives of oral testimony, such as the Spielberg Shoah Foundation interviews, which interviewed some 50,000 survivors over a decade in the 1990s and 2000s. So our learning the lessons that can come from Auschwitz, somehow we've been provided with accounts after accounts, and each survivor in some way has their own contribution to make. And we can go to them and we honor them, as was said, we honor them by opening our eyes and ears and being able to learn about Auschwitz, about Jews and life. Yes, please.
Okay, as always, thank you. I'd like to ask you if you could comment on what some of us seem to think is a bizarre Nazi tracking of the Jewish calendar, to the extent that several very significant deportations, selections at Auschwitz and at other campsites, et cetera, seem to be coordinated with Jewish holidays and the Jewish calendar. So I'm just asking if you would say something about Nazi tracking of the Jewish calendar and using holidays specifically for slaughters outside villages with the Holocaust by bullets, or at several camps, not just Auschwitz, specifically deciding that holidays or the eve of holidays were the times for special actions. So I'm just asking if you could comment on those two calendars, as it were. The calendar maintained by Jewish prisoners and the Jewish calendar maintained by the Nazis themselves.
Thanks very much. I think your question can be maybe highlighted by if we were to ask, I don't think I'll do, but if we were to ask how many people here in our group know the date today in the Jewish calendar, there probably would not be a high ratio. It's not even, if you ask Jews, certainly in America, you wouldn't get a high ratio, and certainly if you ask a general audience, meaning just to drive home the point of your question, it's not usually something that non-Jews preoccupy themselves with. Jewish calendar, okay, it's a Jewish thing. Jews are involved, they want to have their holidays, they do, so that's within the province of the Jews. So it's abnormal abnormal meaning it's not the usual thing for non-Jews to come to know and involve themselves with Jewish calendars. There are exceptions, but generally. So for the enemy to do that is bizarre. I think that was the word that you used. Yeah, it's bizarre. Just as a preliminary, this conversation once came up with the great Holocaust historian Dan Mickman, who writes in his book on Jewish historiography in the Holocaust, there's not a single document that we have where the enemy put in a document that they were going to use a Jewish holiday for this particular action. That's only on the side. No? So with Auschwitz, we have, for example, that on Rosh Hashanah 1944, there were 1,500 boys, teenage boys, who were imprisoned in a barracks, who were going to be murdered on that day. They knew it. They were not given any food or drink. The rabbi whose name I mentioned, in the course of my talk, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Meisels, was informed about this, and he dedicated himself to going with his son, Elazar, Rabbi Elazar, to blow shofar for them in the barracks, even though it may be that he was not going to get out when they were taken to be annihilated. And he did that. So that's only one instance on Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, usually a great sacred day that also has an aspect of festivity. And here it was used in such a barbaric way. So let me give another kind of general comment. I wrote a book on the Jewish calendar and the Holocaust, and one of the motivating forces for doing that was the Jewish calendar is known in Holocaust studies generally for the reasons that you say, because the enemy made bizarre, perverse use of it. So I thought, this is the way that the Jewish calendar is going to be known? Can't be. It has to be known as the Jews use it. So I don't know. It's how to say. It's very generous of you to ask me. I'm not sure I can speculate any better than anyone here on what it is that would move the enemy to pervert the Jewish calendar, that meaning that has deep, memorable blissful memories for those Jews and to use it for cruelty. Anyone, any sensitive person, I think, can not that your question is misdirected, but I'm just saying I don't think I can explain it in any good way because it's perverse, it's cruel, and it's wanting to control Jewish time. We are the masters of your time. That's the only, perhaps, addition that I can make. You think you own this time, you think it belongs to you, nothing belongs to you, the enemy is saying. So the making of Jewish calendars by Sophie Zollberg and Elisa Borinsky, the other 40 calendars that I go through, and there were many more that are destroyed, say no, it's not yours. You think it is? No. I'm going to show you, and we're going to show you. And every time any prisoner observed any mitzvah having to do with the calendar, it was saying, no, this is ours, it belongs to us, you can't take it away. It was given to us to allow us to serve the Almighty in the way that we have been guided by the Torah to do. So it's, it's even while acknowledging that seems to have happened, the great deportation of Warsaw Jewry took place from Tisha B'Av to Yom Kippur, so on and so forth, that it was within the Jews' power to say, no, you can do always whatever you want, but it belongs to us. Maybe one more question? Yes. It's one more. Yeah.
Hi.
Please. Who are you?
My name is Esther. My question is, towards the end, you were saying how one of the realizations within the faith is that the practice of absence of not having to practice anything actively is also part of the will of God.
Yes.
So how does that realization, how is that reflected in the further practice of Judaism within Auschwitz or after when he's reflecting on his time there, or how faith is continued to practice or reflected on? How is that practice or that ideal seen or reflected within future practices?
You mean generally?
Generally, or within, I forget who that person was, but how did that realization impact
You mean
him?
Rabbi Adler, I think,
Yeah.
was one of those. Yeah. So I think that that's what a searching, wonderful question. That I think for Rabbi Adler, generally, it meant no guilt. No guilt. We did there what we could. And it was also God's will, what we couldn't do. So if someone says, oh, but you didn't really observe the Sabbath, or you didn't light the Hanukkah candelabra, or you didn't eat kosher food, he said, no, that was clearly God's will, that we couldn't do those things. If we would have been able to, not risking our life at every moment, because preserving one's life supersedes almost all, that if we would have, okay, but no, that was God's will. He was saying, I think, and if you see, it's called, you can look under Rabbi Sinai Adler, it's called Continuity in Crisis. It's a 10-minute video of his testimony given at Yad Vashem, I think about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more, but roughly that. And I think he was saying, no guilt. no guilt. We shouldn't feel an iota of guilt. And so that was what that stirring reflection on exemption means. I think for him, and I think it's true, generally, hopefully, for all who survived, and their survival was itself a observing of all those mitzvahs that were God's commandments, that were God's will not to be able to do, and the realization that life itself, the preservation of life is sacred beyond anything else. Except for if you're asked, God forbid, to murder another person, then you have to give up your own life. Because life is precious no matter whose. So what a wonderful question to conclude with. And all the questions were, and I thank you for coming and providing this very special atmosphere in this very special room with this very special faculty, community, and I look forward to being together again. Thank you, and may we share joyous occasions. Bye-bye.